This is part two of Yvon's What Has Become of the Russian Revolution. Part two is titled The Level of Liberty of the Workers in the USSR. We have examined the standard of living of the Soviet worker. The question that we shall try to answer now is, quote, how much liberty does the Russian worker enjoy, end quote. It should be quite obvious that we shall not be able to determine if the present regime is a socialist regime, or if it is moving in the direction of socialism, by measuring the area covered by the new Russian factories, or by discussing the latest official quote theses. We shall come nearer the truth by observing how much real liberty the worker enjoys in his daily life. What may be called socialism has no meaning unless it signifies well-being and liberty for the majority of the population. In order to present the facts as clearly as possible, we shall examine separately, although the distinction is quite artificial, first, the degree of personal liberty, home, work, security, the right to dispose of one's person, allowed to the Russian worker, and second, the degree of collective liberty, speech, opinion, press, congregation, vote, education, he enjoys. Part 1. Personal Liberty. First heading. Security of the home. Whether he lives in a, quote, cooperative house, directed by a centralized organism, or in a, quote, common house, managed by the bureaus of lodgings of his factory, the worker is always under the thumb of the all-pervasive centralized organism of the communist president of the so-called, quote, House Committee. One second. Should he, for one reason or another, displease these powers, he is subject to all manner and means of attention, visits, inspections. He is moved from one lodging to another. His master discovers that his apartment is too large or that it does not suit him. The quest to discredit the tenant, to erase the house committee or corresponding central organism against him, is incessant, reflecting the terrible housing shortage. In the, quote, common house, the eviction that follows automatically, according to the law, the loss of a job, emphasizes the new form of serfdom and has the effect of chaining the workers to their places of work. In the case of the slightest slip in the expression of one's political opinion, the, quote, new social order, end quote, is implacable. The sinners and their families have no right at all. The worker enjoys only relative security in his home or what serves him for a home. New heading. Attached to the factory. The factory has always been a cursed spot for the worker. It has always been for the worker a place where he must toil against his will. The Soviet factory remains a place where he must toil against his will for the Russian worker. The management is the absolute boss, both in fact and according to the new law. The thing that first surprises you in the presence of an armed uniformed guard at the factory gate the first thing that surprises you is the presence of an armed uniformed guard at the factory gate. This guard, controlled by the police, GPU, challenges workers who forget to show their passes in the language used by armed factory guards everywhere. The factory pass, which is renewed every month and bears the photo of the worker holding it, must be shown to the armed guards also on leaving the place of work. And since it is important to fill the workers' minds with a wholesome respect for this bit of discipline, the loss of the factory pass is made punishable with a fine of 3 rubles and more. The card itself cost a few kopecks. This loss, therefore, equals a day's work in the case of the badly paid workers. The fine does not save the worker the need of paying, at a special window opening to the outside, the price of a new pass, including a photograph. To get hired at a factory, the worker stands in line at several barred windows, where he presents the following documents: an interior passport, a work certificate, his military booklet, and 2 recent photos. Up to 1935, he had to show also his food card certificate. Then he answers in writing a questionnaire of 60 to 70 questions. Years ago, after the revolution, you could circulate everywhere in the country with a trade union card. The fact that you were a member of a trade union organization was enough. Little by little, numerous identification papers were added. The Tsarist interior passport, which the revolution took pride in destroying, was reestablished after 1933. To a much greater extent than under Tsarism, every change of domicile by the citizen is rigorously controlled by the state. Entry into industrial and commercial establishments, into administrative edifices, which keep on rising like mushrooms, into stores and many residential buildings, is impossible without special passes. There are barred office windows and stamped papers everywhere. One of the cages at which the worker must present himself to get a job is that of the secret bureau of the factory. The secret bureau of the factory, the door and safe of which are sealed every evening. At the narrow window of this office, the worker must present his military papers. The hermetically closed door and the mysterious air of the occupants of that office help to emphasize the, quote, sacredness, unquote, of the place. The secret bureau of each factory is subordinated to the Ministries of War and Interior, GPU. It elaborates and announces the mobilization plan of the establishment. It puts together all information on the moral as well as the material side of the mobilization. Its correspondence is not sent by ordinary mail, but always sealed, is transmitted through a special service of the GPU. When you are told, quote, the secret bureau wants you, end quote, you feel a chill run down your spine, though you know yourself to be the most innocent person in the world. You must go through the same procedure to leave a job. That is impossible without the consent of the, quote, triangle, the factory director, the president of the factory trade union committee, and the secretary of the communist cell. The shrewd thing is, in that case, is to get one of the two, quote, angles of the triangle to influence the other two to let you go look for work in a location that seems preferable to you. You can solicit a certificate from the factory medical commission attesting to your need for a change of air or work. But sickness, health, and other official means are never sure means without, quote, pull. In the USSR, it is very important to have the right connections. Pull, especially pull with the party representatives. Lacking pull, you may get rid of a bad job by committing intentionally a breach of discipline. That will free you from the unwelcome job, but it will also result in the management putting notations on all your papers so that you cannot get any other work except in a sovkhoz or on some distant construction in the wilderness or in the cold districts. In those, quote, free prisons, you can take your time washing your sin clean. When the punishment has been judged sufficient, you have the right to take back your place in the factory you wanted to escape. A motivated dismissal of this kind always bears terrible consequences, yet it takes little effort to be found deserving of it. It is enough, for example, to have been ill without the recognition of your illness by the office. You are then declared to be a, quote, deserter from the Socialist Labor Front, end quote. You are also considered to be such a deserter if you are late for work a number of times, catching all the unwelcome things that come with such a misdemeanor. On the other hand, some persons are always indispensable. Such individuals are taken in hand by the factory police, instead of being fired for lateness or staying away without official permission. In certain large factories and railway depots, there were in 1933 special detention rooms for these cases. Their qualified workers and technicians who wanted to leave their place of work were locked up for safekeeping after work hours. Malingering can be punished with imprisonment, and when the authorities want to, quote, burn somebody, they often do it under the pretext of, quote, premeditated, systematic, and voluntary malingering, end quote. This amounts to sabotaging the, quote, socialist economy and is a very grave matter. Workers who cannot stand any more of their job try to save themselves the day after pay but that means the loss of 10 to 20 days of wages, as the Soviet worker never collects all of his 2 weeks' pay. His bosses hold back on him a greater part of his wages than the most authoritarian capitalist ever dared to keep. But when you cannot stand the job any longer, the fear of losing 20 days' pay would not stop you from escaping. If the need of having a regular passport, regular military booklets, and work did not oblige you, in that case, to a quasi-illegal life, with the sovkhozes and distant public works as your only recourse, in spite of that, such escapes do occur. The peasant is no more favored. Changing a kolkhoz or leaving one is as hard as changing a job in a factory, since everything that the peasant possessed has been, quote, collectivized. He would lose his all, or nearly all, if he left, leaving with nothing. The peasant has no hope of creating for himself a new personal enterprise and faces few chances of finding a place in another kolkhoz. The worker is bound to the factory as much as the peasant is to the soil. The worker can change his place of work or domicile of his own accord, only at the risk of difficulties that exceed by far those he met under Tsarism. And neither can the worker oppose himself to the migrations found necessary by the, quote, plan. Is that anything but serfdom? The great movements of population observed by the foreigner traveling in Russia do not in any way contradict what we have just stated. The railway trains are crowded because they are small in number for such a large country, where roads and automobiles are relatively few. The forced industrialization calls for much manpower. More than 15 million persons were drawn from the countryside to the city. Every new industrial center necessitates the construction of a new city, with large and frequent displacements of construction workers. Then there is the constant movement of the vast army of liaison, control, and inspection agents that the state needs to keep functioning an immense enterprise like the USSR. New section, forbidden to leave Russia. If there is the need of a passport to move around inside of Russia, a passport is quite naturally needed to leave Russia. Everybody, even a worker, can ask for a passport to go abroad, but this request must be accompanied with a payment of 230 rubles, a month and a half of the average worker's pay, After a month or two of waiting, they return you 200 rubles, 30 rubles less than what you have given them, and ... you are refused a passport. Indeed, only the fine people charged with official missions, that is, diplomats, athletes, literateurs, obtain foreign passports. For the common mortal, requesting such a passport not only means spending 30 rubles for nothing, it is also a sign that he is discontented, and that is a serious matter. You can, however, leave Russia in spite of that, but only if you are, quote, ransomed from abroad with a sum of $300, paid in foreign money, which is certainly not accessible to many people. There remains one means of leaving Russia, illegal flight, but against such practice we have the decree of June 6, 1934, dealing with hostages. Here are the provisions of the law. 1. Passing the frontier without a passport is punishable with death or 10 years of prison for civilians, and exclusively with death for the military. 2. The adult member of the family of a military deserter are punished with 5 to 10 years prison if they knew of the desertion without informing it, and if they did not know of it, with 5 years in Siberia. 3. If a military man is not informed of an escape, he is liable to 10 years prison. If a military man is a civilian, If he is a civilian, The non-informer is subject to the provisions of the law dealing with crime against the state. Let us remember that this refers to peacetime. This explains why we never meet in the West Soviet citizens who are ready to tell the truth about the Bolshevik regime. The fact that such measures are taken shows how great is the general desire to leave the USSR. New section, or new heading, military service. The so-called Red Army is organized in the same manner as other armies. Chiefs are not elected. Chiefs are appointed from above. Speaking to a common soldier, Soviet officers may address him as, quote, comrade so-and-so, end quote. Otherwise, there is the usual distance between officers and men. The Soviet officer can inflict punishment on the soldier. The latter may complain, but only after he has undergone the punishment that his superior has assigned him. Serious breaches of discipline are brought before a court-martial and may lead to acquaintance with the execution squad. Discipline is as rigorous as elsewhere. The only advantage over the old Tsarist army is that the soldier may not be whipped. Military service is obligatory. The active army was increased in 1934 from 600,000 to 940,000 men, and then in 1936 to 1,200,000. The length of service is from 1 to 5 years, depending on the branch and the individual case of the conscript. The draft is effected with the aid of a lottery. Every year about 300,000 new soldiers are conscripted. The men who are not drafted, and there must be many of them, considering the size of the population, go through, for a short period, a simplified course of military training in their localities. All students must take part in this training and pass military examinations. They receive the rank of sub-lieutenant of the reserve after a year of service. Section 2. Collective liberty. All education in Russia is based on the principle that the mind of the individual should be fashioned at will to suit the needs of the government. The masters of the Soviet state, by definition, are the exclusive possessors of the truth. The only truth and the course to be followed in applying it are decided by the directing elite. The population must be adapted to this truth. Man is clay to be kneaded in accordance with the master's desire. On one hand we have the initiate, and on the other the general population, docile in the hands of the initiate. Thus, from the kindergarten to the university, nobody learns to think for himself. The injunction is not, quote, think, but, quote, think this and only this, end quote. The same themes are repeated in the wall pictures of the nurseries, in the books of the elementary schools, in the courses of higher schools. There is one catechism, the catechism of, quote, Leninism, Stalinism, end quote. To get to the highest schools, to arrive at desirable positions, and to hold on to the post already won, it is best to know well the catechism. In the university entrance examinations, the most important questions deal with the, quote, Leninist-Stalinist policy. It is good to have a fundamental acquaintance with the orthodoxy of the moment. For every deviation from this theory is heresy, and any person showing himself guilty of heresy, even in private conversations, loses his position. Provident, quote, go-getter parents therefore put their children, at the age of 5, in the, quote, Octoberist Children's Corps. At the age of 8, good children enter the, quote, pioneers, later the communist youth, and finally the party. The party card is the indispensable talisman for any person who wants to make his way in the world. The Communist Party is therefore the object of a constant rush. The government trade unions, membership in which is practically obligatory, fulfill one of the lower functions in the regime. Their purpose is merely to educate the workers in the spirit of the dictatorship, to organize them for greater production, and to extract from them money in the form of, quote, loans and, quote, voluntary, unpaid hours of work. Originally, the trade unions were organs of opposition. They constitute now an important lever for the state power. Who better than trade union functionaries can confuse and keep in line the working population? Head fixing. New heading, head fixing. A multitude of newspapers circulate in the USSR. The Pravda, the central organ of the party, has numerous brothers all over the country. Every factory issues its special sheet. But of all these publications, local, district, central, factory, sport, party, trade unions, communist youth, Red Army, of all the 10,000 publications, not one prints a line that is not in total conformity with the official opinion of the moment. The same tone, the same style, the same political line, the same words. Every day an unsigned leading article reproduces 10,000 different titles that one must think and say on that day to be, quote, in line. Professional orators are a mighty host in the USSR. They study the technique of their trade in special schools. Professional orators' function is to spread orally the same, quote, only truth, end quote, found in the papers. They are furnished with special periodicals and pamphlets which keep them informed of the last slogans, on the latest manner of presenting the slogans without risking the sin of, quote, deviation. One is a, quote, artist or a, quote, writer in the USSR to the degree that he aids the official propaganda or embellishes the last slogan. A writer with different opinions stops being a writer soon enough, for that writer cannot be published or even find paper to write on. The theater still produces some classic plays and several old operas. It thus acts as a sort of museum of art. But outside of that, the theater, the screen, and the radio produce only what suits the, quote, only truth. They are all under the control of the severest of censorships. The intensity of the official propaganda is so great that it is not only impossible to hear or see anything, but the eternal, quote, only truth, in the factory, lunchroom, at home, in the street, in the movie house, in the newspapers, in books, in the city, or in the countryside. It is impossible to avoid hearing and seeing it. Every evening courses on, quote, political thought pursue you at night into your home. You always need to prove your power of assimilation as a good, wide-awake citizen. Orators, writers, actors, cinema players form an army whose job it is to shape the thought of the population. Stalin found the right word when, in his wisdom, he applied the title of, quote, engineers of the soul, end quote, to his Soviet writers. It is not safe to express your opinion either in speech or in writing. Only in the official organizations may hold public meetings. But even the official organizations, the Soviets, trade unions, etc., cannot meet without the control of the party. The speakers are designated in advance by a superior rank of the organization. The same organs dictate the decisions to be reached at such meetings. Anybody may take the floor. The only condition is that you speak in agreement with the official decision. You may also ask questions, but you must do so orally or sign your name to the written question. There is much criticism at meetings. Everybody criticizes violently and constantly. There is no country where you have so much criticism, but this criticism is directed exclusively against persons who are said not to apply diligently enough the line decided on by the top. Not a meeting passes at the discovery of lukewarmness in a neighbor in the accomplishment of his task. To criticize your neighbor means to push yourself to the fore. You criticize in order to take away a good position from another man, to replace him. These frequent bitter public criticisms call for great pliability. on the part of people who want to keep the confidence of the top. The best way to deal with criticism in Russia is to anticipate criticism or accept criticism. When you know yourself to be in danger, you accuse yourself in time. You do it publicly and energetically. You try to do it louder than your critics. You recognize all your errors, though they may be non-existent, and after the theatrical mea culpa, you express your decision to correct yourself, applying all your strength to the triumph of the line. That is what is called, quote, self-criticism, end quote. Not everybody has the mentality permitting him to play this vile comedy easily. But when you want to keep a good position, moral fastidiousness is not an asset. It is especially difficult for the population to escape this intellectual constraint, this moral servitude, because the youth who's younger than 35, who form 60% of the population and are its most active section, have never known any other regime. Shaped mentally in the total ignorance of anything different but what is about them, the youth has nothing to compare its life with. To a great extent, the youth is free from doubt. Those addicted to critical thought keep their qualms to themselves, for doubt is heresy and makes one liable to heavy punishment. The youth is made to believe that everything in their life that is not convenient is a leftover from Tsarism, while everything acceptable is a gift handed down from above by the new regime. There do exist free minds, but they must keep quiet. The GPU never gives them time to find an echo around them. People do laugh in Russia. Merriment is not entirely gone. The youth born under the regime, ignorant of anything that is not Stalinism, having more or less faith in the promise of future happiness that all societies and movement inscribe on their palaces. The youth does have its moments of gaiety. Human beings tend to laugh no matter where they are. They have a psychological need for laughter. There's laughter in prison cellars, in barracks, in trenches. There is gaiety also in the obligatory Soviet demonstrations. New heading. No elections. Neither factory directors, nor judges, nor the public prosecutors, nor the heads of the armed forces, nor any officials are elected. They are all named from above and remain absolute masters in their domains. They form a self-recruited hierarchy. Neither are the trade union and party officials selected. At all steps of the ladder, they are chosen and proposed to the organization assemblies by the higher organs of the trade unions or the party. No one has the right to organize outside of the official bodies. In the latter, there is, however, no hope of expressing one's viewpoint. Any attempt at independent organization is qualified as treason or plotting. Immediately after Kirov's assassination, the plenum of the Central Committee of the party decided to establish the secret vote, direct elections, and equality of representation (for city and country) for the Soviets. This form is not what it seems to be when regarded naively. Without the right of presenting other programs and other candidates than those named by the government, we shall continue to have here the same farce. Indeed, the new arrangement will be of advantage to the government. Studying the negative ballots, it will be able to find out exactly how many malcontents are found in any region. This system has been practiced for a number of years in fascist Italy and in Hitler's Germany. The direct election of delegates to the different Soviet congresses could only become important if the latter played a part in the direction of the country, and if they are chosen freely from among the various political tendencies. The new constitution gives the peasants the same representation as the city dwellers. According to the very complicated system practiced before, the countryside representation was about 3 times as small as that of the cities. New heading. The apparatus of repression. Any deviation of opinion, any opposition, even communist, is branded as counter-revolutionary, and as such is severely suppressed. Whether of the right or the left, whether monarchist, fascist, communist, oppositionist, communist oppositionists, socialist revolutionaries, syndicalists, or anarchists, all who do not agree with Stalin's orders are, quote, counter-revolutionaries. The common criminal generally suffers a much lighter penalty than the political delinquent. The first gets a public trial. The common criminal has the right to defend himself. The common criminal can take advantage of amnesties, etc. The dictatorship fears the free mind much more than the thief and murderer. That is logical. Yet the re-education of criminals, thieves, and prostitutes, which is one of the boldest ideas of the Revolution, has so degenerated that it is now only a bluff destined for naive visitors. At the present time, criminals and even petty thieves are shot, and according to the law of the 8th of April, 1935, children of 12 are also punished by death. The judges and the public prosecutors are, as usual, people of career and are appointed from above, like the Soviet magistrature, so the Soviet police. Since the 10th of July, 1934, the GPU has borne the name of Commissariat of the Interior. This Commissariat of the Interior can, in the manner of a simple administrative measure, that is, without any trial, sentence any person to 5 years of forced labor or exile. This punishment can be renewed indefinitely. The forces of the GPU are specially chosen. They comprise a mobile guard of 100,000 men, forming the best trained and best treated military group in the USSR. The GPU's officers are educated in special schools. A member of the GPU may be permitted to retire, but he is then still attached to the Corps and undergoes periodic training and inspection. The GPU network of informers and spies spreads over all the factories, all establishments, and even residential houses. Many persons in the Soviet Union assume the role of informer voluntarily, either from ambition or as a result of political conviction or from jealousy felt by their neighbor. Anybody who has once supplied information to the GPU has his name, address, and photo in the bureau and finds it hard not to continue playing the part of the informer. Denunciation and provocation have become an integral part of the mores and civic virtues of the country as a result of the prevalent ignoble competition that goes on among citizens of all ranks to get on the good side of the authorities in the Communist Party. Illegal action within such a net is almost a total impossibility. The Soviet citizens must watch carefully his own correspondence, his private conversation, even with those nearest to him. The least imprudent can bring grave consequences. Writing abroad, you cannot forget the postal censorship. Here is a classic case in the land of Soviet socialism. Peter, a comrade in your shop or office, a neighbor or friend, a native of your village, or a relative is uttered in the course of a little gathering of relatives or friends one evening over the samovar, some rather circumspect reflections on the troubles of the times. Perhaps he expressed some doubt that such misery can bring well-being and liberty to the workers. His opinion was reported. 3 days passed and you don't see Peter in the shop. You never see Peter again. From Peter's wife, you learn that at 2 o'clock in the morning, some agents of the Interior GPU searched their home and took along her husband. Where? She will not be told. But she will nevertheless go to bring him some food in the so-called, quote, inner prison of the GPU. The road of repression is so well known that if anybody disappears, you go first to the window of the GPU office rather than to the morgue. For 3 weeks, for a month, the poor devil awaits his fate in prison. He undergoes all kinds of examinations and may receive no visitors. It is then that the most insignificant details in his past take on the most decisive importance. An investigation reveals that he rarely attended meetings, that he was not a, quote, shock worker, and attempted to wriggle out of the so-called spontaneous May 1st and November 7th demonstrations, the case is clear. He is a, quote, counter-revolutionary. His wife will then receive from the GPU the only communication she will ever receive in this affair, a notice to bring on a certain day, at a certain hour, at the North Station, warm clothing for her husband. She will then perhaps be glad to be freed from all this uncertainty and learn that he is alive. She will see him at the station for several minutes before he leaves for Siberia. She will learn that he will be gone for 3 or 5 years. Some letters, permitted at very long intervals, will help her to remember. Such is the story of Peter. Peter is not a great hero. Peter is not an active revolutionary belonging to a political movement. Peter is an ordinary worker who merely felt the need of saying aloud, not too loud, what he thought. We defy anybody to deny that Peter is not a typical and general case. There are few people in Russia who have not had one or several Peters in their family, among their friends or acquaintances. All means of repression are good for, quote, counter-revolutionaries. Deportation, concentration camps, prison, capital punishment. Deportations means exile to Central Asia, Siberia, the Far East, where the climate is so harsh that the free population hardly ever goes there. These are unpeopled regions with almost no means of communication, far from any frontier. Many Siberian cities owe their origin to the Tsar's political deportations, and Soviet, quote, socialism continues the work of its predecessor. It peoples the virgin forest and the desert with deportees. It is not difficult to make the deportee give up his opposition in those regions. He cannot leave the district to which he has been assigned, yet he must work for a living. There he can be worn out with hard labor, or he can be refused any chance to earn enough to survive on. Besides, entire villages of peasants exiled for refusing to be, quote, collectivized. It is especially the relatively well-known militants who are deported there. The prison is no more agreeable in Russia than anywhere else. The Soviet prisons are, however, much more crowded. We challenge the Soviet masters to give the number of political prisoners held in their prisons. Capital punishment is executed with a shot in the nape of the neck fired by expert professional, quote, socialist executioners. The minus order is the order prohibiting one from staying in a certain locality. It is inflicted on revolutionaries judged to be dangerous after they have finished their regular punishment. The concentration camp merits special attention because it is a new thing, because its name is deceiving, and because the Russian concentration camp sometimes holds hundreds of thousands of convicts. Footnote: hundreds of thousands is not an exaggeration. In one Soviet concentration camp, the one that built the famous White Sea-Baltic Canal, 12,484 prisoners were freed at the end of the job for exemplary conduct, while 59,516 others had their sentences reduced for the same reason. Decree of the Central Executive Committee, August 4th, 1933. It is evident that if 72,000 convicts could distinguish themselves from their fellows, the mass of the latter reached at least 200,000 or 300,000. And it's important to note that a lot of people died in the construction of that canal. Like a lot of people, like thousands of people died. Forced laborers. End footnote. Where am I? It is no more or less than the old galley prison, but a galley prison that takes in indiscriminately thieves, assassins, prostitutes, saboteurs, and political prisoners. That is where Peter will live. The concentration camp is of relatively recent origin. Under Stalin's regime, the number of the imprisoned underwent a steady, formidable increase. It not only became impossible to house them in the prisons on hand, but even to feed them without bankrupting the state. Therefore, the ingenious GPU invented the commercial galley enterprise, called concentration camps. Gathered in groups of several tens of thousands in the middle of the swamps that are to be drained and the forests to be cleared, or on the site of the canals that are to be dug, the convicts are housed in Adrian huts under the guard of the GPU troops. They work and they are given to eat, in accordance with how much work they do, 600, 400, or 200 grams of bread a day. The task to be accomplished is always increased because those who hope to get a diminution of their sentence become, quote, udarniks, shock workers. Okay, that's good to know that finally know after reading so much that udarniks are shock workers. The hardy fellows get along. The weaker brothers croak, since the least slump in productivity brings a reduced portion of bread, and that in turn brings automatically reduced productivity, and so on. But if the work is hard, the quote customs are more so. It is not difficult to imagine what happens when our Peters live in forced promiscuity with prisoners hailing from the underworld. The latter are the only category of convicts that are organized to impose their own law. It is understood. Only vice and the fist count inside the camp. It is impossible to have it otherwise. To escape this situation, Peter has the alternative of suicide or escape. Both will, however, lead to the same end. For you may escape from places of deportation, but not from concentration camps. A man deported to Minosinsk or Narim is surrounded by thousands of square kilometers of wilderness and impenetrable forest. Surveillance over him may therefore be reduced to a minimum. Under Tsarism, we had the terrible secret police called the Okhrana. Under Tsarism, there were provocations, deportations, hangings. But we must recognize that the Tsarist regime was much less harsh with political, revolutionary prisoners. Publicity and trials in defense by the accused were permitted. Capital punishment was not employed as widely as now. Deportees were, quote, exploited to a much smaller extent. New section. Stages in the destruction. New heading. Stages in the destruction of liberty. The evolution in the suppression of the liberty of the Russian workers by the Soviet state may be summarized as follows. 1917 to 1918, there was integral democracy for the different tendencies of the Russian labor movement. Socialist, quasi-socialist, quote, socialist revolutionaries, communist, anarchist, all collaborate in the Soviets, trade unions, and other organizations of the revolutionary regime. 1919 to 1923. The Civil War ended in the total hegemony of Bolshevism. All other organizations were persecuted, suppressed, destroyed. But within the Bolshevik Party itself, diverse tendencies continued to face one another. There was one political organization with a semblance of democracy still lingering within it. 1924 to 1927. Even before Lenin's death, the struggle began among the heads of the Bolshevik Party, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Bukharin, Rykov, Stalin, etc. This struggle ended in Stalin's victory. Stalin's triumph put an end to the appearance of democracy inside and outside the single party. 1928 to 1937. The Stalinist absolutism is perfected. We have now a personal dictatorship adapted to the development of the new social form. New section. Why this evolution? New heading. Why this revolution? I don't know why I'm making a big deal of saying heading as opposed to section. It doesn't fucking matter. The progressive destruction of the liberty of the Russian worker is not the accidental thing that some people like to think it is. The classic capitalist economy is a disorderly, chaotic economy. It functions like a machine that cannot be controlled by any mechanic. The classic capitalist economy moves from prosperity to crises, from progress to catastrophe, in pursuance of its own spontaneous laws. Classic capitalism is a, quote, competitive regime. Rivalry in the conquest of profit entails rivalry in obtaining the manpower that produces this profit. Because of this, the traditional capitalist regime needs a working class that is relatively free, at least, to sell its labor power to the best buyer. This liberty to sell one's labor power is possibly not as ludicrous as Karl Marx found it to be. The quote chaos was to be replaced with a quote plan. In Russia, we see the birth of a quote organized economy, an economy that is supposedly subjected to man. Labor is regulated quote scientifically. All the social wheels, all their movements follow pre-established circuits. The economy of the country is quote directed, obeying the laws imposed on human reason. The single machine functions in accordance with the will of the wise conductors who hold the national levers. A class of specialist technicians, quote, initiatives, the brains of the plan, rules more arbitrary than any masters have ruled over human beings before. 5 or 6 volumes, comprising a manual of algebraic formulae, summarize for the new masters the entire life of the society, the mainsprings of which they hold in their hands. Economic competition has disappeared within the country, but with that the liberty of the workers has also disappeared. The plan is exacting. The quote plan is exacting. The plan brooks no indiscipline. In the quote planned society, every man has a numbered place assigned to him. He is put in his place. He is labeled, controlled. He must do what the top orders him to do. The worker becomes a tiny mathematical symbol in the general plan. His food, his clothing, his fate are so many graph lines drawn on the charts of the masters of the plan. Each worker is a disciplined soldier. He is a sort of convict irredeemably attached to a determined place, to a determined task, the choice of which he cannot question. The laborer works in accordance with the pre-established scheme. The quote brains of the plan, who live on the worker's labor, think for him all the time, in all situations. The disappearance of what we usually recognize as capitalism does not therefore necessarily bring emancipation to the worker. The Russian example shows the possibility of a regime that we did not foresee, the rule of the economic and social, quote, technician, succeeding the rule of the traditional capitalist. Okay, so that is the end of part 2 of M. Yvon's What Has Become of the Russian Revolution. And that section was called The Level of Liberty of the Workers in Russia. The first part was titled Personal Liberty of the heading Security of the Home, attached to the factory, forbidden to leave Russia, military service. And section 2, titled Collective Liberty, with the headings Head Fixing, No Elections, The Apparatus of Repression, Stages in the Destruction of Liberty, Why This Evolution?